One of the most important pieces of information we can gain from reading and interpreting these phylogenetic trees is an understanding of the relationships between organisms and groups of organisms. So the purpose of this web lecture is to teach you how to use these phylogenetic trees to understand what groups are more closely related and which are more distantly related. One of the most common misunderstandings about evolution is that it occurs in a sort of progression, with simpler versions of an organism being gradually replaced by more and more complex versions. But that is really an oversimplification of what evolution is. Evolution is really a lot more similar to your own family genealogy. As I'm sure you're aware, it's not an accurate interpretation of your family history to say that your great-grandfather gave rise to your grandfather, who gave rise to your father, who gave rise to you in this linear progression, right? You know that there are lots of members of your family that are related to you in different ways. You are related to your siblings through your parents, but you're also related to both your siblings and your cousins through your grandparents. And there are other branches with aunts and uncles and steps along the way. This is simplified. And then also you have lots of relatives that you're related to through even more distant ancestors, your great-grandparents and going on back. And you know intuitively that you are more closely related to your siblings than you are to your cousins, right? And the reason for that is that you share a more recent common ancestor with your siblings, so those would be your parents, than you do with your cousins, grandparents. Okay, that's the last common ancestor you had that's common to both you and your cousins. So we say that you're more closely related to your siblings than you are to your cousins because you shared a more recent common ancestor with your siblings than you did with your cousins. The same thing is true for evolution, right? We don't have fish that turn into salamanders, that turn into cats, that turn into you. We had common ancestors with all of these groups, and we're related to each other in similar kinds of ways. So humans and cats are both mammals, and they are related to each other by a common ancestor that was a mammal. Humans and cats are both related to amphibians because they're all tetrapods, and they are related to each other by some common ancestor even further back of four-legged vertebrates or tetrapods. And we're all related to fish by an even more ancient common ancestor that's common to all of the vertebrates. So we think about this in sort of the same way. When we ask who is more closely related, what we're asking is, with whom did you share the more recent common ancestor? That is the only thing it means. It doesn't matter if the two groups look very different from each other. It doesn't matter if one group retains very ancestral characters while another group has a lot of very derived characters and seems much more complex. The only thing we're interested in is where we find that most recent common ancestor, and we need these phylogenetic trees to be able to locate that. To understand why this is true, we need to understand something about what these phylogenetic tree diagrams are telling us about the evolutionary history of the groups that it depicts. And to understand that, we need to think about the process of speciation. So speciation is the process by which a single species splits and becomes two different species over long periods of evolutionary time. So that's what's shown here in this figure. We've got a population of fish that are variable in color. We've got green and blue and white fish. And let's say over time there starts to be a barrier between two different parts of that population that's going to separate them and keep them from interbreeding. And let's say on one side of the border, there's coral reef, very colorful, and so the green fish blend in better and survive better. On the other side of the barrier, there's mostly sandy beaches, so the white fish survive better and are less visible to predators. The blue fish kind of don't do as well as either one of those, but they're still popping up in the population for a while. And over long periods of evolutionary time, we're going to have fewer and fewer of the blue ones on the coral reef side and no white ones, since those are being selected against. On the other side of the barrier, we're going to have more and more whitefish until eventually you end up with two separate species, a species of whitefish on the sandy beach side and a species of greenfish on the coral reef side. So we can depict that in our phylogenetic tree diagram in the same way. So here we have our variable population of green and blue and white fish that undergo a speciation event. So each one of these nodes that you see on a phylogenetic tree diagram represents a speciation event where one species split and became two different species sometime during evolutionary history. So this species gave rise to two branches, two daughter species, green fish and white fish. And so just for the sake of expanding this tree and giving you a more complete example, let's say that there were still some bluefish in this population also, and they got separated into a more suitable habitat for bluefish, and then another speciation event happened here at this node where we had a split into two branches, two daughter species from one single ancestral species, into a greenfish species and a bluefish species. So this is what every phylogenetic tree diagram you ever see is depicting, this evolutionary progression of speciation events through time. So who are the closest relatives in this phylogeny? So if we think about this common ancestor that occurred at this node, this is the most ancient common ancestor. So remember that when we read a phylogeny, it's always from root to tips in terms of the time scale. This is older, younger on this side. So this speciation event happened closer to the root, so it happened longer ago. This speciation event happened closer to the tips, so later in time. Because greenfish and bluefish are related by the common ancestor that happened more recently, greenfish and bluefish are more closely related to each other than either of them is to whitefish. Greenfish and bluefish are both equally related to whitefish, and they're more closely related to each other than either of them is to whitefish. This is the common ancestor of greenfish and whitefish. So you follow the branches back to the one that joins both of those two species. If you look at the common ancestor between bluefish and whitefish, you follow it back to find the node where both branches lead to those species, and you'll see that the most recent common ancestor for bluefish is exactly the same ancestor as the most recent common ancestor for greenfish, so we say greenfish and bluefish are both equally related to whitefish. So let's practice this on a more complicated phylogeny. Here we have a cladogram of the mammals, so you can see this is a much more complicated phylogenetic tree than the ones we've been looking at. And I've selected a couple examples to show some very common mistakes that people make when analyzing these more complicated cladograms. So let's look at this first question. Who are more closely related to pigs? Horses or whales? Is a horse more closely related to a pig, or is a whale more closely related to a pig? So the temptation here is to say, okay, pigs and horses are both farm animals, they both have hooves, they both have four legs. Of course they're more closely related to each other than they are to whales. But let's look at the actual phylogeny and find these common ancestors. So horses belong to this group Perissodactyls, we find here. Pigs are up here on the phylogeny. So let's find the common ancestor of pigs and whales. We just follow the branches back to where the node where one branch leads to pigs, the other one leads to whales. That common ancestor is right here. So this is the most recent common ancestor of pigs and whales. Let's find the most recent common ancestor of pigs and horses. So pigs are here, Perissodactyls are here. We're going to follow it back. Right here is the node where one branch leads to Perissodactyls, including horses, and the other branch leads to pigs. So this is the most recent common ancestor of pigs and horses. So we know that the time scale runs from the root to the tips. This common ancestor happened longer ago than this common ancestor. So pigs and whales are related to each other by a more recent common ancestor than pigs and horses. So because the red dot is closer to the root than the blue dot, that ancestor lived longer ago. Pigs are more closely related to whales than they are to horses. Surprising, huh? Let's look at another example. Who are more closely related to sloths, primates, or bats? So first of all, let's locate these groups on the tree. We have sloths here, primates, and bats up here. So here, The temptation is to say, well, sloths and primates are right next to each other. On the tree, they must be more closely related than they are to bats. Again, let's look at where these common ancestors are. So first, let's see sloths and primates. If we go back, the node that leads to sloths on one side and primates on the other is this node right here. So that represents the most recent common ancestor of sloths and primates. So now let's look at the most recent common ancestor of bats and sloths. So here are bats. We're going to go back and find the branch. So this leads to bats on one side and sloths on the other. It's the exact same node. So we have the most recent common ancestor occurring both at the exact same node. What that means is that primates and bats are both equally closely related to sloths. Primates and bats are more closely related to each other than either of them are to sloths. So their common ancestor is right here, further out. But they're both equally closely related to sloths. This is just like the situation with the bluefish and the greenfish, both being equally closely related to the whitefish and more closely related to each other. So we say because the most recent common ancestor is the same most recent common ancestor, sloths are equally closely related to both primates and bats. So let's just wrap up with some important points to remember from this lesson. First of all, being more closely related means one thing and one thing only, that you share a more recent common ancestor. Being close to one another on a phylogenetic tree does not necessarily mean that they are closely related. Okay, so we saw that sloths and primates sat right next to each other on the tree, but they were not more closely related than sloths and bats, even though bats were very far from both of them on the tree. Sharing more overall similarity does not necessarily mean that they are closely related. We saw this with pigs and horses. Also, just because one group seems to be more derived, to have more derived characters than the other group that you're comparing, does not necessarily mean that they're not closely related. So the example of whales, they're very highly derived. They're more closely related to pigs than either of them are to horses, even though pigs and horses share a large number of ancestral characters related to being land-dwelling mammals. And then finally, to determine who the closest relatives are, what you have to do is look to see where in the tree the most recent common ancestor is for both of the two comparisons that you're making. If it's closer to the root, it's older. If it's closer to the tips, it's more recent. The more recent common ancestor joins the more closely related species. If the root is the same, both of those two groups are equally closely related to the reference group.